Good morning. So let's do a quick intro to me and Chris first, for those that haven't met us before. So just very quickly, I'm Mike Pingstone. I'm Deputy Director of Procurement at South Central and West Commissioning Support Unit. And this is the third of three of these meetings, conversations. We've looked at test me now. We looked at market engagement 1, contracting 2, and this third is on the provider selection regime. The 2B legal regime that is going to be coming in at some point, although we'll get to that, for the procurement for provision for the provider selection of healthcare services. And Chris?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chris Fuller, the Director of Procurement for South Central and West.
Thanks. I'll share my screen. We've got 11 slides, plus here's our email and phone number slide, and a slide with our pretty hummingbird at the end. So 11 main slides. So not a huge number of slides, but to say we are absolutely happy to be. Well, I'm happy to be, and I think Chris is too. I'm happy to be interrupted, and also plenty of time for questions or conversation at the end. So I will share my screen. Bear with me a second. So I've got this. Suppose it won't come to you. You won't see it as a completely full screen, because I've got this in Acrobat rather than PowerPoint. But hopefully that's still good enough in terms of being able to see the screen. So provider selection regime. Okay. So as part of Brexit as an impetus, but also Brexit as something that did give the UK government flexibility in terms of what it was able to do around public procurement, because prior to Brexit, we, as with many things, and we'll put aside, of course, the politics of it all, we're in lockstep with the European Union on lots and lots of things. Public procurement policy and public procurement law being one of those things that we're in lockstep with the European Union on. Immediately post Brexit, of course, not hugely high on policy agenda, but immediately post Brexit, it was intimated that public procurement would be one of the things where the UK would take back control and would cease to be in lockstep with the European Union on. And that meant two things. It meant for public procurement in general, so all public procurement across not just the NHS, but local authority, academia, the whole of public procurement, all contracting authorities. There is a process going on to change public procurement law in general. And then next to that, there are separate proposals, pretty well advanced or very well advanced, around specifically the procurement law regime for healthcare services. And that, the healthcare services, is what we're talking about, and is the provider selection regime. And right from the outset, it's quite telling, I suppose, that the terminology provider selection. We're no longer, from policy perspective, no longer just talking about procurement as the vehicle to select providers. It could be non-competitive, but we'll get to that. In terms of how big of a change this is, there are some pretty significant changes coming around, like I say, the selection of providers for healthcare services. Healthcare has at least since I've been around. So I've been in public procurement since 2006, and the procurement of healthcare services has always been treated, or since then at least, I can't speak to before then, been treated somewhat differently. Has always had a slight carve out. In the 2006 regulations, we talked about healthcare services being Part B services. So they had their own legal regime around them where you had some additional flexibility. In the 2015 public contracts regulations, which we're on right now, we talk about healthcare services being procured under a light touch regime, which again has a slight carve out in terms of what we have to do for the procurement of healthcare services. But largely, up until now, or up until when the provider selection regime comes in, it's still been the same core piece of legislation that we've been talking about in terms of the procurement of healthcare services, as it has been for all other services, and that fundamentally is changing. We will have a specific and separate regime, of course, to be agreed and to be finalised, for the selection of providers for healthcare services, as we do for the selection of providers for, for extreme example, £1 million worth of tables, or a slightly nuanced example, the selection of providers for some social care services. And the ambition is also, so of course Brexit made this possible in terms of not having to be in lockstep with the European Union anymore in terms of various legal things. But why is about an ambition for greater integration and collaboration between NHS organisations and partners. So this does absolutely fit in. We can talk about pros and cons, but this does, as a pro, absolutely fit in with greater integration around local systems, and of course the move from CCGs to ICBs and ICSs, integrated care boards, integrated care systems, that are thinking more collaboratively and thinking about integration within those localities. When is an interesting question. So the original when for the provider selection regime coming in was April 2022. Various things have delayed that. Of course, COVID is one thing. One thing that delayed that is there were other significant priorities, of course, rather than the procurement regime. The original target was April 2022 for this provider selection regime coming in. That slipped to October 22, then April 2023, and now it's being suggested that may be kind of late summer 2023. But I think the takeaway is that we're getting close. The delays are shortening, perhaps from 6-month delays to 3-4 month delays, and that we can absolutely expect the provider selection regime to come in. Do not anticipate it. We do not anticipate it to be something that is delayed and delayed and delayed until it then goes away. Absolutely expect it to come in at some point during 23-24. Who does it affect? So it affects well, anyone that procures, or any public authority, contracting authority, that will be procuring healthcare services. So it affects NHSE, ICBs. So we've got a slightly old slide, still got CCGs on there, but NHSE, ICBs, and so just to be very clear, it will also affect local authorities where they're commissioning healthcare services. So we've put there such as sexual health or public health services, or a local authority where they are either a lead commissioner, like we've put there for a healthcare service, or as an associate commissioner, of course, where the service is a mixed procurement, but is some healthcare, some social care perhaps, or let's make an even more extreme example, some healthcare and some IT. It's about what is the service predominantly, and if it's predominantly a healthcare service, then this new regime, the provider selection regime, will apply, even if it's, like I say, local authority procuring it. At the moment, it's relatively clear what a healthcare service actually is, as far as the current regime of procurement law is concerned. But to be very, very clear, well, actually, it isn't going to be very, very clear. There will always still be edge cases, which needs discussion. But healthcare service is around a service that actually provides healthcare to an individual. Could be physical or mental health, but it's about provision of services to an individual. Interestingly, it may be that the provider selection regime is slightly wider in its scope than we currently apply under the current procurement regime, because as an example, PTS patient transport services are currently not considered to be within the light touch regime currently. So patient transport services, we currently procure as a fully regulated service. However, it's proposed that patient transport services would come under the definition of a healthcare service under the provider selection regime. It's a good example because patient transport services are particularly tricky market and particularly tricky to procure and to commission. But other services, such as a signposting service, will likely remain as fully regulated, so not under the scope of a provider selection regime, because it isn't delivering healthcare to an individual. It's pointing that individual at where they can then receive their healthcare. But like I say, there's always edge cases as to what's under a regime or not, and it's all for discussion. I've already mentioned social care services. So social care services are currently covered under the light touch regime, but it is not intended but a pure social care service. The pure social care services will be covered under the provider selection regime. So social care services won't come under the provider selection regime. They will come under the proposed new set of procurement rules for everything else for the public sector. And of course, as I've already said, all other non-clinical goods services, medicines, community pharmacy, etc., won't be covered by the provider selection regime. Now, also, just to be clear, sorry, I should have said at the outset, I can't see hands or anything. So I'm assuming that no one has put their hand up. So I'm just pushing through, but I can't see if anyone has put their hand up. Please just
keep my eye out, Mike, don't worry.
Oh, thanks. Okay. So, like I say, the provider selection regime is quite different. Whereas if you're used to procurement, or if you've had contact with procurement, also significant contact with procurement colleagues at the moment, you'll be used to maybe a discussion with your procurement colleague about, okay, what route are we going to take? Is it going to be through Contracts Finder? Is it going to be through Find a Tender service? And are we talking about a single stage procurement? Are we talking about a multi-stage procurement? Are we talking about a competitive dialogue? It's more about that kind of, you may have felt the conversations around procurement. More about process. What process are we going to use, as opposed to are we going to do it at all? Whereas that might be a bit of a shift with the new provider selection regime, where there are 3 decision circumstances: 1, 2, and 3. Actually, this terminology is also shifting, but we'll stick with this terminology of decision circumstance at the moment. And And so there's no talk here of, okay, is this a single stage procurement, a multi-stage procurement, an innovation partnership? We've moved away from that process talk here and towards actually, is it one, continuation of existing arrangements, two, identifying the most suitable provider for new or substantially changed arrangements, or three, competitive procurement. And then competitive procurement is, of course, do it. Well, we'll get on to that. But you see, that's an immediate change of focus. So on to decision circumstance one. Decision circumstance one is split into three, A, B, and C, and this is continuation of existing arrangements. So 1A is where there's simply, there's no other provider. There's just objectively no other provider or realistic alternative to the current provider, such as 999, type 1 and 2 urgent emergency services. And so interestingly, and this might be for this might be a point of conversation or debate, and commissioner requested services or essential services. So a number of services might be defined as commissioner requested services or essential services that actually there is a market for. So that's an interesting one of whether actually you could simply say, oh, by virtue of this being a commissioner requested service, this is therefore a service that we don't have to do a competition for. That probably isn't a, that my sense is that probably isn't a foolproof defense. But 1A generally are services where we can objectively say there just is no market, so we don't have to do any kind of procurement. We can continue on with the current provider. 1B is where actually we don't have to do a procurement because alternative providers are already available. So through choice, for example. So if you've got an any qualified provider process set up, or if statutory choice applies to services, so the elective consultant-led services, then you can say as you kind of can currently, but not in as clear a way as you will be able to in the future. So by saying this is decision circumstance 1B, you'll be able to say choice applies. There's already alternative providers in the market, therefore we can just continue on and continue to contract with our provider or group of providers. So 1A, 1B, hopefully fairly clear. 1C is then where we start to get into a bit of murky water potentially. And 1C, I'll read fairly verbatim. So decision 1C, where the incumbent provider or group of providers is judged by the decision-making body to be doing a sufficiently good job in relation to the key criteria on the next slide. So your provider or your group of providers, your incumbent or incumbents, are doing a sufficiently good job, and the service requirement is not changing considerably. You do have to, under that circumstance. Now, if I just stop there, that sounds, or could sound, pretty great from a commissioner perspective. If you think, okay, so I don't fancy doing a procurement. All I have to demonstrate is that this provider that I'm using is currently doing a sufficiently good job. So that doesn't a particularly high bar, does it? Sufficiently good job, and the requirement isn't changing considerably. And we can think of some words to ensure that we make it sound like the requirement isn't changing considerably. But just to be clear, that isn't decision circumstance 1C is absolutely not carte blanche to do to simply write a short paper to your board, your governing body, whatever, and say they're doing a decent job. It's not changing considerably. we want a direct award done. Because the decision-making body, the contracting authority, ICB, trust, NHSE, whoever, absolutely does have to still have a solid audit trail, and still does have to put notices out to the market, and they absolutely have to be able to demonstrate and say against a range of an assessment why it's not changing considerably, and also establish, auditably, that the incumbent is doing a sufficiently good job. And to do this, you have to use, like I say, for 1C, 2, and 3, it's proposed you have to use these 5 kind of headline criteria. We've discussed these internally as a team and thought, okay, so currently, where we're doing a procurement, we might ask bidders actually a set of 20 questions or something. Actually, would all of those questions fit into these five headline areas? And we think they do. So you have to still consider, again, this might not be with necessarily in conversation with the market. This may be predominantly a desktop-based exercise, but you do have to consider in terms of quality and innovation, in terms of value, so price as well, but value for money, in terms of integration and collaboration, access inequalities and choice, and service sustainability and social value. Exactly why the incumbent is the most appropriate organization, or the incumbents are the most appropriate group of organizations to continue doing this work. We have seen that, and it may be that integration and collaboration is something that might take a particular focus, but you'll need to consider all 5 of these areas. And as I've also mentioned, let me just check what slide I'm on. And as I've also mentioned, this also can't be done in a dark room. There is still the requirement, as there is now, for, if you started a procurement, you start it with a contract notice and advert, you end it with an award notice at the front and back end. There are still requirements there will still be requirements in the provider selection regime to publish notices, to say what you're planning to do and to say what you have done in relation to various decision circumstances. And as I say, I've only talked about 1C there, 1C being where you wish to remain with your provider, but this set of 5 kind of key criteria also applies to decision circumstance 2, where you wish to identify the most suitable provider for new or substantially changed arrangements, and it also applies to decision circumstance 3, where you simply make a choice to run a full procurement in a transparent, equitable, and non-discriminatory way. And on that, I am passing over to Chris.
Okay, lovely. Thanks, Mike. I think it's probably interesting to reflect upon that that in the first publication of the consultation for this new regime, it was kind of considered in some ways a sort of a bonfire of bureaucracy, that actually healthcare would be free from the governance and documentary responsibilities that would come under procurement, and would free up commissioners to get services in a much more quickly and efficient manner. And I suppose that was the ambition within the regime when it was first brought out. I suppose these things, in reality, that once you start understanding that you're spending billions of pounds worth of public money and you're making decisions which are positive to some people and negative to other people, that there does need to be a level of governance, record keeping, scrutiny, and check and challenge around that. So built into the regime that Mike's talked about, there is responsibilities for all decision-making bodies to have transparency in the form of publishing notices and detailed record keeping across the board. Now, those of you who are reasonably familiar with procurements will understand some of these publications that we need to make. So for some of the circumstances, and there's a slide after this that deals with the when and how, you need to publish your intention beforehand. Say, I work for Bristol NHS, and it's my intention to choose the most suitable provider for a new service, using decision circumstance 2. And then when you finish making that that assessment of the most suitable provider, you need to publish the fact that that you've chosen that provider, and this is the rationale of how you've done that. And there does need to be a standstill period, as there is in procurement at the moment, to manage that. Now, the standstill period that they're built in for these requirements is a 30-day requirement, but that's subdivided. That's a total requirement of 30 days. But the initial period is a 10-day period, as it is at the moment with current procurement regulations. So if the decision-making organisation says that they've made a decision on provider A, if provider B is unhappy with it, they've got 10 days to raise a representation, and then that needs to be resolved by the end of the 30-day period within that. So across the whole range of committing and contracting for services, there is strict responsibilities under this regime for all organisations to be really transparent and saying who you are, what you're doing, and when you're doing it. And there's a couple of slides later with the level of detail that will need to be put on with that. So I'll save that for then. And as far as record keeping is concerned, it is not acceptable simply to say, oh, we like this provider, we think they're best, therefore we want to give them the contract. It is necessary to undertake the scrutiny that Mike's already pointed out on those 5 areas, and under those 5 areas to record your rationale, the logic of why you've made that choice, and to provide evidence as to why they are the most suitable providers, or they should have their contract extended. And the important part of it is that under the regime, there is likely to be a responsibility that if there is a representation or a challenge, that you will be required to hand over to publish all your records of how you've made that choice, both in terms of the decision making that you've made, and the groups and the approval channels and governance that you actually went through to make the decision within that. Mike, can you pop to the next page? So here's a table that's still currently under review, and let's be clear on this. So everything we're saying at the moment is based on published information with regards to the consultation, the design of the regime as it has been shared. The final guidance documentation and the final legislation is still under review. This hasn't been laid before Parliament yet, and so although they're targeting July as the potential start date, that could slip if the parliamentary agenda or timetable also slips. So, but as it's published at the moment, you only need to publish your intentions in advance if you're looking to do a most suitable provider or procurement route. or competitive route. You must make, say, full decision making on all areas across that, and you need to publish the intention to award a contract, and at the end of the standstill period, confirm with a formal notice of what you have finally awarded. And you will also need to make publications if you do any modifications over a certain value within these regimes. So the requirement under the new regime to be absolutely transparent, to use, and they intend to use the contracts finder service that's currently in place to place adverts and decisions against all of that is still very much paramount as far as the regime is concerned. Next slide, Mike. So apologies for the level of detail on this, and I won't read it out verbatim, and I think we've shared this for the website, haven't we, Olivia? So this will be available for people after the event, so they can look down through this. But I think the reason why we chose to put so much detail on here is to give a flavour of the level of transparency that will be required all the way through this process. So if you're looking to do the most suitable, you need to advertise the fact that you want to do, why you want to do it, and who will make the decision beforehand. And when you've once you've made decisions about it, there's a lot of information you do need to publish around the type of contract, who you've awarded it to, the contract value, the dates of the contract, how much any conflicts of interest, and the dates of representations and issues like this. So if you're familiar with placing publication notices now, these are not dissimilar to what you're used to, and it will require strong document keeping and record keeping to ensure that all of these areas are properly recorded. Next slide, Mike. So, and again, this slide is listed as under consultation because this is an area of some debate at the moment. So, one of the seemingly real benefits of this regime, and I think it will be as well under a lot of areas, is if you have a perfectly good contractor doing a perfectly good job for a perfectly good service, you do have the ability to continue with that service based on the process that Mike explained a bit earlier. But there is responsibilities that if that service changes significantly, then it may stop you formally pressing ahead with that simple renewal of a contract with your existing provider. And the level of changes to the contract are predominantly around finance. They are only around finances. I suppose it's the simplest metric to measure against a contract. Although I think for healthcare contracts, there's lots of other metrics that are far more important. But for this purpose, they've chosen that the financial regime is important for that. So they're saying that if your contract has changed by more than £500,000, £500,000, or more than 25% in the period when it was originally awarded to when you're looking to renew it, that may be considered a significant change, and therefore triggers the responsibility to undertake a most suitable provider arrangement, which is considering other local providers as well within that. Now, as far as this modification is concerned, there are some exceptions. So, for instance, if there is a contractual inflation measure every year going in, you don't have to include the contractual measure increase on that. And also, if there is an increase in activity that's outside of the commissioner's control, so you award a contract for 1,000 clicks, and simply by increasing population, increasing demand, that contract stays exactly the same, apart from the fact that you then do 2,000 clicks. Those additional clicks do not need to be considered under these thresholds for the contract modification. Now what isn't clear, and this is where the water's kind of a bit muddy on this one, is how do you determine when there's a combination of all of those? So for instance, let's say you've changed the contract marginally, which has increased the contract in some areas, but patient numbers have gone up and there is an inflationary uplift. Are you allowed to identify elements of that, of those increases, and exclude them and include other elements? So as part of the policy team we're working with at the moment is thrashing out those issues to find out how you cope in the sort of hybrid world of modifications and changes. But and I think some of that will come out in the wash. There are some issues under emergency measures, whereas you will be allowed to award contracts and extend contracts if it needs to be put in place urgently for patients, or for situations such as the COVID pandemic that was there, or if there's particular safety concerns to patients regarding, let's say, a failing GP practice or dentistry practice, and you're able then to put in place contracts immediately to ensure the public safety on that side. So watch this space on contract modifications. It's still under consultation, and it will take some measured reflection from decision-making authorities as and when it comes in, to ensure that we remain compliant within the requirements under the provider selection regime. Mike, next slide. So the final bit on this one is we call them procurement challenges in old language, and what happens at the moment is when you make an award of contract, you have a standstill period. We often exercise a voluntary one under the light touch regime, and it gives providers 10 days to say, we don't like what you've done. We think you haven't treated us fairly, and we want to raise these concerns with you. What happens at the moment is if we disagree with them and we push back and say, I'm sorry, we don't agree with your challenge, the challenger has the opportunity to go to court, submit papers to the court, and put the award of contract on hold whilst the issues are dealt with through the legal channels. Under the provider selection regime, that option for raising challenges through the court has been removed, and so I'll go on to the whole and flow of that in a bit. But so in the first instance, if you publish your notification, and that could be a notification for in extending your existing contract, it could be a notification that you've chosen the most suitable provider, or you've gone through a procurement. A provider can, within the first 10 days of publication, turn around and say they don't think they've been treated fairly, and they want to challenge the outcome, or make a representation for the outcome, is what they say here. It's then the decision-making body, the ICB, the local authority, NHS England, to consider their challenge, really mark their own homework, and then go back to the provider and say, we've listened to your concerns, we've considered these issues, and we believe the award is robust, it's solid. So here's our decision on that, and please go away. Now, one would hope that the decision-making body acting reasonably will make a fair consideration of the representation and respond accordingly, and in doing so, the provider will receive that response and say, thank you very much for considering it. This is where we stand, and I'll go away quietly. That doesn't always happen in reality, does it? And so the second option is that they're now able to ask for if an independent review can be taken. And again, these are all some of the things under consultation at the moment. And if an independent review is requested, it's the decision-making body's responsibility to decide whether or not they want to do an independent review. And if they do, then to appoint an independent reviewer, and needs to be free from conflicts of interest, probably from another organisation, probably with the right qualifications and capability to do that, and for them to review the process and the process that was employed, the information that was considered, and the decision that was made, but only in the context of the challenge that has been made. So it's not a full review of everything, it's just a review of the individual challenge that has been made. We'll see how this shakes up, and if that is the final way forward. And it'll be interesting to see from providers' point of view, if that is the case, whether they just take a scattergun approach to challenges and say everything is wrong, and raise issues around that. And the independent person will then make a non-binding decision, again share that with the provider, and that should be sufficient for any representation to be concluded. And their decision may be to make recommendations to the ICB that actually perhaps the process wasn't followed as fastidiously as it could have been, and then there's an opportunity to rewind to the point where the divergence from the process went. It may recommend that it should be abandoned and started again using a different process, or it may actually uphold the decision of the ICB to say, yeah, actually, we think that it has been made reasonably, and the challenge is either unfounded or vexatious within that. So that will come out in the wash in the time for the guidance to be published. But if the provider is still unhappy with that, the only route then to challenge the decision is through a judicial review. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been involved in any sort of judicial review, but it absolutely burns management time, with regard to firstly deciding whether or not a judicial review is reasonable to be held, and then if it is to be held, the amount of time it takes to go through the scrutiny of all the documentation and providing interviews and statements for against the judicial process. And I think the reason behind this is that, and they're also writing the legislation in such a way that it's very specific in the way that authorities should conduct themselves. So the legislation will suggest that there's a step-by-step approach to managing each of these processes. And through those step-by-step processes will ensure that you have complied with the responsibilities as a decision-making body to meet the requirements. So it may not necessarily consider whether you made a good decision, but it will need to ensure that you've made a decision following the regulations faithfully. Thanks for that, Mike. I think that's so. We've included this, and this again is for people to reflect on. If they have a look at the download the slides thing, but we put a little side-by-side thing of what the current procurement regulations require under these various headings of mandatory use, direct award, financial thresholds, and so on. So what the current regulations say and what the provider regulation selection regime needs you to do. So again, I won't read them off line by line, but I think it's it's useful to reflect on those. If the regime comes out exactly as we think it might do on these. Thanks for that, Mike. Next, and that's us. So I saw there was a couple of issues put in the chat. Our colleagues from Oxford first, I think. Vince. So
yeah, I suppose that they're both kind of related in a way. And hopefully not a silly question. I was just kind of interpreting it against some real life sort of scenarios that we're working through at the moment. So when in terms of the PSR, then, if social care isn't included but healthcare is, what issues does that kind of present as if you're trying, to work in an integrated commissioning environment and maybe putting integrated health and social care contracts together with pooled budgets that don't have ring fences on how the money is spent? So say you don't have, let's say you have a 10 million a year contract, you don't have, there's £8 million for healthcare and £2 million for social care. You've just got a local authority and an ICB contributing to a pooled budget that funds a contract that is delivering integrated health and social care. You might have voluntary sector subcontracts or something like that in there. So
yeah,
which way do you turn in that sort of situation?
It's a bloody good question, Vince. And
not
one
stupid,
that has
but
been...
then I'm happy with that.
Yeah. Well, shall I stop there then? Just leave no. So within the guidance, there will be direction on how you can manage mixed contracts.
Right.
So the provider selection regime, and I don't know why it hasn't included social care, but that's
it seems to run counter to the expectation for commissioners to be putting integration and and harnessing the flexibilities that go along with it at the heart of everything you do. If you buy into all of that rhetoric, it doesn't help in that respect.
A cynical person might suggest that the reason it wasn't is because it clashed with some trade deals that had previously been done post Brexit. But who am I to be cynical? I've got it on the record anyway because I'm being recorded. So oh dear, my cynicism is now in perpetuity. Anyway, but within the regulations there is guidance on how to do mixed contracts, and to give guidance of when it is suitable and when it isn't suitable. So, for instance, if the integrated contract, and I understand what you say about the flexibility of the money that as it might flow within an integrated arrangement, but if it's likely that the social care element will be 80% and the healthcare element 20%, and you should have a pretty bloody good gut feel about this as you go with it, then that would have to come under the regulations that cover social care.
Okay.
If it's sort of 50-50 or 70-30 for healthcare, then you will be able to use the regime for that.
That sounds dangerously like common sense then.
It does, but within common sense there's shades of grey, isn't there? And when there's shades of grey, if there's people who are upset about it, they will try to use those shades of grey for their advantage. I think we just need to be minded on that. And your second question around if we're rebuffed on the direct award, do you want to explain that?
Yeah, sure. It was just for a particular piece of work. I'd been looking through the like the consultation draft of the PSR, but also the NHSE guidance around provider collaboratives and the wonderful world of delegation agreements and all of that stuff. And I think I'd kind of just, again, interpreting it against a particular scenario that I'm dealing with at the moment, and some interpretations of that NHSE guidance that maybe are quite similar, I think, to the presumptions of carte blanche that I think you were talking about earlier, Michael, around the PSR itself of, it doesn't matter what happens, we don't need to contract with you because this is all going to come over to us as a delegated through a delegation agreement. And I think there's a lot of presumptions around that. I've noticed there's that requirement in the NHSE guidance that says you can't go down this route as a means of avoiding having to put a contract in place, which sort of almost seems like, well actually, am I just being, is it just one of those things of you just have to manage the people and manage the potential for gaming within the system of, if route A, you have a direct award of contract under the PSR is, because of the evidence requirements for transparency, etc., in there, not made available to you, is it likely that people might just seek to go down the route of delegating the same activity to a provider collaborative? And could you argue that that's effectively just a contract under another name?
Provider collaboratives are considered as a decision-making body under the provider selection regime. And so the regime applies to them equally as it would do a wider commissioning body.
Oh no, I suppose what I mean is really is an ICB deciding to delegate an area of activity directly to the provider collaborative.
Okay.
And apologies, I mean, if I might be misinterpreting what I'm reading, but just cross-referencing the two documents together seems to create some interesting scenarios.
Yeah, and I see Olivia's got her hand up, so she must. I could speculate on some of that, but I'll give you the floor, Olivia.
Well, I'll be in the same place, but I was wondering whether when an ICB delegates an area, that what they delegate is the responsibility for the commissioning or the provision, and then what you mentioned, Chris, which is actually the mechanisms by which that provision is obtained or contracted for would still be ruled by the contractual regime and the procurement regime. So what is delegated is not here's a provider with a provision attached. It's here's a responsibility to provide this, and then
it doesn't
either
really
go
help
through the 1, 2, 3.
But doesn't that create some situations then? So if you go into the provider collaborative, where it could effectively just be awarding it to, if it's going under the PSR, isn't it effectively a direct award to itself under some scenarios? So a provider trust could have the authority to commission and provide an area delegated to it by the ICB, and then conclude that it itself is the most appropriate provider to provide it.
That could potentially be an outcome for it.
Okay.
Within the guidance, there is whole sections on conflicts of interest and management of those issues, because we're still spending public money. There still needs to be appropriate governance and diligence around that. And I think there may be some responsibilities, especially around ICB boards, where they're made up of a collection of providers and whatever. There'll be responsibilities for people to recuse themselves at the right time. But the delegated issue is will be interesting, won't it, on some of that? I think there'll be some grey areas.
We're just trying to figure out some of the real world applications of what it might look like, and it's just getting that balance between, embracing the new flexibilities or the new world, while making sure you still retain an appropriate level of checks and balance without reverting to people innately reverting back to what they used to do. Seems similar to the requirement for place-based partnership boards not to end up reverting back to old joint commissioning exec arrangements with little bolt-ons on there, but we'll find our way through, I'm sure.
And what I will pop into the chat is that the central policy team have now published a link, I think, where you can, it has an update of where we are with the provider selection regime, and secondly, you can actually apply to attend their training arrangements. Have you seen that?
No, I haven't. If you've got a link you could share, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So I'll pop that into the chat now.
Oh, great. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Any other queries? I know we sort of zoomed through it, and it's all a bit new. But I do think it might help. With the original purpose of some of these things, these conversations were around easy access to voluntary sector, and if you're generally doing any qualified provider style arrangements where patient's choice may be there, this may give you a route to being able to do that in a flexible way. Okay. Lovely, Olivia. I think we're done then. With 4 minutes to spare.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And I put the link at the start. I think the chat is a running chat, so people should see it. As you both mentioned, the recordings and the slide decks have all been uploaded from the very first webinar that was held in October that set the scene, and then the series of 3, today being the concluding one, that will be there within the week. So thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.